Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to the Medtech track for more stimulating discussion. We've got a lovely packed afternoon for you today. And I'm delighted to introduce our next keynote panel titled Patient-Centric Approaches in Medtech. Now, as before, I'd like to remind you to use the chat function to put any questions for the panel to them directly, and they will do their best to address them throughout the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to your moderator, to Lala Gregorek from Trinity Delta, who will introduce the session and the panelists in full. Lala, over to you.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm joined by three expert panelists, all CEOs of medtech companies, who will be sharing their perspectives on and strategies for incorporating patient centricity in their respective business models. It should make for a highly insightful discussion, given that we're covering very different technologies for very different patient groups. Please can I ask the panel to introduce yourselves briefly to our audience, and given that we'll work alphabetically, can we start with you please, Ian?
Hey Lala, thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers of LSX. It's a privilege to be back on a panel again. I love this conference. So I'm Ian. I've been running the company for over 4 years now. I joined the company and really managed to focus Sequana on two exciting markets of the US NASH cirrhosis market and the global heart failure market, two enormous trends moving forward, producing transformations in customer and patient care. Prior to coming to Sequana, I was CFO of GC Aesthetics, and prior to that, I had over 20 years in healthcare investment banking across Alex Brown, Deutsche Bank, and Jefferies.
Great, thank you. Marc?
Hi, so I'm Marc Julien. Again, delighted to be back at the LSX World Congress. I was a panelist last year, and it was an amazing experience. I'm sure it's going to be today again. And thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm co-CEO of Diabeloop. Diabeloop is a medtech company that aims to automate and to facilitate the treatment for patients with diabetes type 1. So we've developed an artificial intelligence that automates completely the treatment for the patient, where they don't have to worry anymore of how much insulin they need to inject themselves. The system does it automatically for them. And I've been with the company now for 4 years, and we are hoping to be on the market very soon.
And last but not least, John, can you please give yourself an intro?
Yes, yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm John Milad. I'm the CEO and founder of Quanta Dialysis Technologies. We're a UK-based medical technology innovator that's commercial stage with a device that's CE marked and FDA cleared. Our whole mission is to improve dialysis experiences and to help patients live more freely. So patient centricity is baked into our DNA. And we do that principally with our portable hemodialysis system, which you can see behind over my shoulder, which is designed to give a lot more freedom and flexibility to how this life-sustaining care can be better provided to patients wherever they may be.
Great, thank you very much. So I think we'll start off on a very sort of broad and overarching question, topic and question. So until relatively recently, development and commercialization of medical devices has more focused, I guess, on addressing the three primary audiences of regulators, payers, and clinicians. Are we now reaching, or have we reached the point where putting patient needs ranks as highly as the needs of the clinician? And we'll do it the other way around. So we'll start with you, please, John.
Okay, great. Well, clearly that classic triad remain important stakeholders in everything we do. I think it would be useful to introduce the concept of necessary versus sufficient. So it's absolutely necessary that we meet the needs of providers, physicians, and payers. Without that, we don't get access. But it's increasingly the case that that is no longer sufficient in order to build a successful medical device company, especially in a world where there are broad macro trends to push care into the community, to reduce the acuity of the setting where care is delivered, and to better engage patients in their own well-being. What we are seeing is that satisfying the needs of patients has become necessary for a medical device manufacturer or innovator to have a successful product.
Great. Marc?
Well, I think, John, you're absolutely right. And the clear three players that you mentioned, Lala, are key, cornerstone of our business and our thought. But in some instances, patients are extremely well educated on their pathology and how to treat themselves. And actually, while developing a product, you can drive from their experience and from their insight some features or some key UI, UX, things that they would like to have to be able to really use at ease the system. And that's really what we've done with Diabeloop. To develop our system, from the very beginning, we work with patient associations, with actually patient advocates, or even patients themselves from the company. That we have, more than 15% of our staff that are actually with, diabetes type 1. And so we listen to them a lot, because we know that, it's good enough to have the doctors, the payers, and the regulators said that your product is right. But if the patient doesn't use it and doesn't feel at ease at using it, then it stays on the shelf. So I think you're absolutely right, Lala. This is a key transformation of our industry, is to put back the patient at the center of the development of products.
And certainly with your focus on diabetes, it's a very, very different market and a huge contrast with what Ian is working on with Sequana. So very interested in your thoughts too, Ian.
Hey, no, thank you, Lala. No, I echo what John and Marc have said, but I think we have an obligation here to take our industry forward, to move away from traditional approaches of cost savings, convenience, quicker, easier, whatever it is. Making it easier for the doctor or making it easier for the hospital we've got to go beyond that. We've got to come up with something more than what the patients really want, quality of life. What's frustrating to me is, as you look at payers basically in the US give no value towards quality of life at all. It's all driven by what the right DRG coding is here. They don't put the patient at the middle of the triangle. We have the ability to transform patients' lives. We are in a market. I focus in liver complications of liver cirrhosis. Liver cirrhosis has traditionally been a market dominated by alcohol abuse and viral hepatitis. Frankly, not the most attractive markets to be focusing in on for payers or clinicians. And that all changes though when we move towards the middle class disease of obesity. We have no problems in spending billions and billions on the treatment of cardiovascular disease and high cholesterol, but we do have a problem of spending money on liver disease where now the causes are identical. So my focus and the focus of our organization is giving patients back their life. They may only have 12 to 18 months to live, but we have an obligation to give them the highest quality life we can in there. So that's where we drive. And I have to keep butting heads with the payer system. It's what we do. It's part of our mantra in the organization to deliver better outcomes for patients.
And that's great. I think this is a nice point to sort of, I suppose, turn more to your companies. And where the focus is there, particularly, Ian, you've touched on a number of the challenges you've faced. I'm interested in all the challenges that you will have faced at your appropriate companies, and also how has patient-centricity been applied to the design and the development of your products? Marc, should we start with you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that helps focus on patient and helps making sure that the patient for us is as the center of the development of our product is that we are a software that we've developed is a software, and digital and and software and artificial intelligence help us to personalize and the system and the treatment to that specific patient. And so that's one thing. And so when you develop the product, you need to keep that in mind, is that this new age of development allows you to have very precise medicine and personalized medicine. And the other thing is that when you develop the system, you get the feedback from the patient, because as I said, we do focus group, we do a lot of input from patient, and because it's a software, within a month or 2 or 3. It's easy to implement those changes. Now, the issue for us is that the regulation and the payers are used to have systems or products that are designed and that will change every 2 or 3 years. For us to be able to make sure that we have and we provide to the patient the best system, we need to update it every 2 or 3 months or 6 months. And so there's going to be a challenge for the regulator and the payer to move from a product-based payment to a software on the go system for the benefit of the patient and the doctors. And when as you said, the patient centricity forces us to do that, because we know that the next module, the next layer of software, the next adjustment will improve the life of the patient, and so we want to rush that to them.
And I think following on from that, it's quite interesting, because I know that obviously with John's technology, we're looking at, I suppose, turning on its head the established treatment practices, whereas with Ian, there's nothing there for the patients other than what Sequana's developing. So if I can ask John to provide a little bit more information about where Quanta fits in. John, sorry, you're on mute.
All right, we're in
Quote of the year.
I'm still singing the refrain of 2020. Sorry about that. So I also think it's worth just bearing in mind a simple observation as well as I answer that, which is the irony here is healthcare has always been and is mainly about the patient, right? Healthcare doesn't exist for the benefit of the doctors or the hospitals or the payers or the providers. All of that is there because patients have needs, health needs, right? That require some type of intervention. I think what's happened though is in the past, there was a view that the patient is a passive entity in that process. Something's wrong, patient goes into a hospital or sees a doctor for an intervention, and they have no agency, and the system makes decisions for them in their best interest. And the big thing that we've seen is one, an increasing understanding that there is a huge diversity to patients and clinical presentations. So the concept of personalized medicine and needing to really fine tune and attenuate whatever we're doing to the needs of that individual patient, and not just looking at them as a homogeneous population. Two, understanding that patient engagement can have a positive impact on achieving better outcomes, right? So patients who are educated, patients who are aware, patients who are empowered to participate in the care tend to have better outcomes than those who are in a position of merely being the passive recipients of stuff being done to them. And thirdly, we see that technology, is enabling patients to the locus to shift from traditional care delivery settings to the patients themselves and into their homes. Whereas historically that, frankly, in many cases was difficult. And you can look at each field of medicine and see that. I mean, initially, diabetes patients had to go into a hospital for an injection of insulin, right? I mean, it was technology that enabled for that shift to happen. And we see that in multiple fields of medicine. So technology becomes the enabler of shifting to a more patient-centric view of care delivery. And we've seen in our field, historically, patients who have kidney failure, they require some form of renal replacement therapy. If they're not fortunate enough to get a kidney transplant, the conventional method has been, well, we have these big complicated machines, dialysis machines, that can provide this renal replacement therapy. They're large and complicated, so they can't move around. So it's a fixed installation. As complicated devices, a specialist workforce is required to operate those devices and to manage the delivery of care. And so what you saw, especially in the 1980s and 90s, was the emergence of standalone clinics that are designed to deliver that specialized care. And patients come in from the community to receive that care. It's really just an iteration on the old idea of sick patients go to a hospital to get treated, right? It's not a very patient-centric or community-centered approach. As technology has improved, and frankly, we benefit as medical technology innovators from a lot of the innovation that's occurred in consumer electronics, right? So when you look at our device and how it works, it's built on a platform of consumer electronics, right? It's built on Windows 10. I didn't need to develop, the operating system or the tool chain to make it work. Out of the box, it's enabled for the Internet of Things, right? We benefit from the fact that it's possible to get high definition, really responsive touchscreens as your interface that have largely been developed for consumer applications, and we can bring that into medical devices. So a lot of the things that we're able to implement in order to create a product that enables patient-centric care, we're borrowing from broader technological innovation and then adapting it. So a lot of what we need to do is become an integrator of tools and technologies applied to the needs of healthcare and patients. And so if Quanta had to develop, let's say, the means of remote connectivity and data security and how develop our own display, we wouldn't be anywhere, right? We don't need to develop those things. We need to think about how you put it together in a smart way. So then in doing so, we're able to facilitate, frankly, what is the natural solution for certain types, for certain disease states and therapy areas are better served by pushing that out into the community, into the homes, and into the patient's hands. And where that makes more sense, then we can design products, systems, and solutions that cater to that. And again, I think diabetes is a really good example. Nobody goes into a hospital anymore for their injections. Patients are able to self-manage for their blood glucose. We're seeing that shift happening in dialysis now as well, where more patients are able to dialyze at home. We're seeing alignment with payers as well. So payers are looking at this, and they're not necessarily primarily motivated by patient experience or quality of life. What they are motivated by is the overall cost of managing patients with a certain condition. And what they're seeing is, hey, it's cheaper if patients can dialyze at home. I don't need an army of skilled workers to deliver the care. Don't need to pay for the transport of getting them into these centers. We can deliver better care, for example, more frequent dialysis. When patients are in control of the means of their therapy, they can dialyze more often and longer, getting closer to a physiologically normal state, right? And then you see better outcomes. Most importantly, reduction in hospitalization. More money in the US is spent on hospitalization of kidney failure patients than is spent on the delivery of dialysis. So if we can do something that moves the needle on the hospitalization, we can significantly drive better health economics for payers. So people are starting to understand these things, and therefore, for maybe reasons that are we call it selfish altruism, the payers are getting on board with a different model of care that embraces patient centricity. Maybe not for like the philosophical beauty of it, but for the pragmatic and practical advantages.
And in terms of sort of, I guess, new patient models of care, that is something that I suppose is at the heart of what you're doing, Ian.
Not sure it's new patient models of care. I think it's for part of our business. So for liver, we have two very interesting contrasting audiences. Liver is a market that, frankly, there was no innovation in the past because no one cared. When you're dealing with a patient group with no voice, a group of essentially alcoholics or drug abuse patients, there's very little voice out there in the community, very little in the way of hospital administrators are going to stand out and say, okay, I'm going to prioritize my budget for this year. I'm going to start off with the alcoholics, then I'm going to move on to the drug abusers, and then at the end, I'll move on to the hip transplant for the granny. That just doesn't happen in a patient budget. There's a patient advocacy side here as well. What we see is this transition. The way the FDA gave us breakthrough device designation was not because we could provide an enlightening experience to the classic alcoholic. It was because they see this huge health emergency of NASH cirrhosis coming through, and they realize that the drug companies are not going to be able to come up with a drug good enough to deal with NASH in the short term. NASH is never going to be cured entirely. NASH is going to be a management of a chronic disease, just like high cholesterol. And they see the need for a better solution. You cannot have a treatment that was developed by the ancient Egyptians being used in the 21st century modern American population. That is where the treatment of liver cirrhosis is today. So that's why we exist. That's why the FDA is pushing it on so hard. But the payers go like, whatever. You talk to some hepatologists and they go, when it's an alcoholic, they go, well, they're hard to treat, these patients, so maybe I'll just leave them on the drainage. You talk to patients now talking about your grandparent who's got 18 months left to live, and they've worked hard all their life. They just had they like pizza and beer a little bit too much, and now they've got cirrhosis as a result of that. We have to give them the best quality of life for the last 18 months. So it's not a new model. It's a recognition that some markets are fundamentally changing. I want to pick up on something that John said around kind of the evolution of diabetes. There is no step. I think the movement to home glucose would never happen. If suddenly we invented glucose today, it would not go to home glucose tomorrow, because regulators and clinicians are way too uncomfortable with the idea that patients can kill themselves. It has to come with decades of evolution in there. The way we're looking to treat heart failure now, with the therapy that we're looking to develop, we could move straight to a self-administration approach there. But we know full well that the regulators and the clinicians are going to be much more comfortable for it to start off being administered in an outpatient department or in a doctor's office, and then pushed out into the community subsequently. So you have to pick up with the evolution of that flow there. And when it comes to the whole treatments here, there are some elements where you're working in alignment with the system here. So getting patients out of the hospital, keeping patients at home, not having a caregiver look after them, not having a caregiver drive them in and out, that's cheaper for everybody here. But there are some cases where it's not cheaper, and it's actually patient quality of life is key. So I know there was a question from the audience say, why don't we align doctors and patients? Well, it's obvious. If you can align doctors and patients, you would. Doctors, patients, payers, all in alignment. You make it cheaper, you make it quicker, you make it easier. That's a no-brainer. I think what we're talking about here are systems where it's not easier for everybody. You've got to make it a little hard for some person to make it easier for the patient at the end of the day. So and that is where the challenges lie, because the payer still predominates here. And you have to find ways to make it work at the moment. The patient is clearly not at the center of the puzzle, because we do not have an unlimited budget out there. But quality of life is key. And we struggle, like drug companies have done it very well in terms of quality of life assessment here. And the payers are much more flexible when it comes to quality of life improvements there than when it comes to devices. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of catching up on the device side versus where the payers are.
One thing I, Ian, just to build on what you just said, and taking again the example of diabetes, one thing that is going to change the perception of the payer and the regulator is that our system now are connected, and so you can actually have an ongoing sort of checking that everything is going fine at home versus what used to be, because we didn't have the internet, we didn't have the IoT and the connected system. And with that, it's actually very interesting to see that some of the payers, and I saw a question also about the German reimbursement for the digital therapeutic, but in France also, we're starting to see some of the payers thinking about, well, I can have a go and trial because I know that the system is connected, and I can have a look, as it goes, to see whether things are fine for the patient or not. And what it also means for the doctors, at first, doctors feel empowered because they used to be the authority and they used to be the decision maker, and we providing tools to the patient to actually, as you said, John and Ian, take decisions for themselves. And so the doctors seems, somehow for some of them, they're still disempowered of the treatment of the patient. And actually, the way we say that to the doctors, and again, it's by putting again the patient in the center and say, well, hang on, your doctor, your aim is to treat the patient that needs to be treated. With the solution we're providing to you is we're going to release you all the time you spend with patients that don't actually really need so much overlooking, and you will be able to focus on those that really needs your help, because for plenty of good reasons, their system, their pathology, their body, their physiology are so difficult to manage that you'll have to spend more time, and you'll have that free time, because those patients that are actually easier to be treated with those new technologies, actually you just have to have a look on your screen and check every morning that everything is fine, and you will have done with your checking that those patients are okay. So actually, what we also saying to the doctors and also the payers is that actually we are freeing the doctors and the system of all the patients that actually don't really need so much support, and so we can refocus on the one that really need that support.
Great.
I'm just commenting on some of that. I think you put it the other way, which is incentivizing doctors to do real good for patients as opposed to actually just get them through that episode of care as well. So I think some of the evolutions, John mentioned it a bit in some of the payer mechanisms now. Dialysis is probably the most advanced in terms of a payment mechanism here. Yeah. What we can see now, I think, is that heart failure, fluid overload of heart failure and diuretic resistance is already partially there, not as far as dialysis, but getting there. And that means actually, if you can put you can put the patient at the center of the model by developing the model. And what I think, I don't know dialysis nearly as well as John's experience is there, but what we're seeing in heart failure is ways that patients get discharged from hospital with severe congestion still, because it's hard for the doctors once a patient becomes diuretic resistant to really get that fluid off them. But you know what, if they can ship them out, then there's pressure from from hospital management. The DRG only covers just under 4 days. They're typically in there for 5 and a bit days. So the doctors are being pushed to get these patients out. Some of the Affordable Care Act issues in terms of being fined for readmissions is key, but the models also need to evolve. And I think you look at the chunky ones. I think here on this call, we've got diabetes, we've got renal failure, and now with our second program, we have heart failure as well. Those are, I think, the 3 largest Medicare cost buckets out there. So I think those are where the patient models are evolving to, and the models have to catch up. And we sometimes have to push those models as well. I would love to rent my product for liver cirrhosis. I've always looked at it. I would much rather say I'll pay a monthly fee to me, and as long as a patient doesn't need an external drainage, just pay me a monthly fee, and every time they need a drainage, skip that month's payment. But the payments just don't catch up here. The models just don't catch up. The legislation is behind, so it takes a while to be really innovative here.
I think that's a really interesting point that you were making, building on what John said earlier about how the system makes the decisions. Surely patients are part of that system, but clearly from what you're saying, you know, the regulatory agencies, the reimbursement authorities, and the clinicians all have a role to play. But what are the barriers that you're seeing that are slowing development, adoption, and wider deployment of patient-centric devices? And, you know, on the other side, what are the drivers for positive change? Ian, do you have any thoughts?
In the US, it's clear. DRG system inhibits the coding system inhibits innovation here. If you have a device that doesn't have an existing code, you have got a real problem out there in getting your innovative product through, particularly if you are replacing a series of chronic care. So for us, we replace a regular drainage, and each regular drainage is about $1,500. Our device is more like $25,000, but we say the equivalent cost though is $50,000 over the remaining 15 months of a patient's life. So you have this great cost argument, but the payers go like, there ain't a DRG code there. So that getting your own DRG code is a real problem. However, what CMS and FDA have done in the last 18 months with NTAP and now with MCIT is a leap forward, a huge leap forward. That enables us. We now get 4 years of national coverage from Medicare, where all our patients are going to be Medicare ready. We now get 2 to 3 years of top-up payments. That enables our company. So the investor now goes, okay, you've now got 3 to 4 years to generate the real world data to get a code and to validate why you should exist. Otherwise, you're sitting there scrabbling around with payers. The LVADs nearly never made it to market because of this reimbursement challenge. And that's the barrier. But what Gottlieb did at FDA with working together with CMS was really fantastic. I want to sort of big praise to them for what they've done with breakthrough devices and what they're working with CMS.
And John, having had a sort of a recent clearance of your system, what are your experiences on the regulatory and reimbursement side in the US and further afield?
Yeah, so in the US, CMS have actually been highly progressive in the last couple of years, putting in place reimbursement mechanisms to incentivize better care, more patient-centric care and home care. What's interesting to observe, though, is that the FDA hasn't been as nimble and making it any easier to get a device cleared for that application. And of course, the irony is all of that reports up to the same Department of Health and Human Services. So there's a little bit of a lack of joined up thinking. So CMS have got a big push in the US right now to get 50% of new dialysis starts on home dialysis by 2025, 50, yeah? Massive expansion of home dialysis. Meanwhile, the FDA are still treating home dialysis like it's some sort of research project that requires a very high standard of evidence to get a label for home use. And so there is, in my view, still a little bit of a disconnect between what one arm of the government's doing in terms of putting really good reimbursement incentives in place and what another arm is doing in terms of still taking the same view they took on home dialysis 20 years ago, right? And neglecting, actually, we've had millions of patients on home dialysis, millions of treatments on home dialysis and tens of thousands of patients over decades. And that really there is no scientific reason, need to prove that home dialysis is safe and effective. The literature is abundantly clear on it. Yet for every device that goes in front of the FDA for that, it's not just the device that's on trial, it's the whole modality. And the FDA seems to still think there's something inherently risky about home dialysis that requires a very high level of burden of proof. And so we got our FDA clearance for facility-based dialysis, and we'll be launching into the US this year for those use cases, basically everywhere but the home. But for home use in the US, we'll need to conduct a study and report that back to the FDA, and they'll need to bless the results in order to get the label that allows us to promote that. Whereas in Europe under MDD, MDR, we don't need to do that. So a device that's cleared for dialysis naturally is safe and effective in any setting, right? And so there's no additional burden. Even if you go north of the border in America, just to Canada, right? Again, no additional home study needed. So it's interesting to think about the multiple stakeholders and their interplay. And in our field, very much welcome the innovation that's come from CMS. Just wondering why the FDA, their thinking is not yet aligned with the policy objectives that the federal government are trying to achieve.
But John, just a quick one on that. Is that renal only? Because I see FDA making leaps and bounds in how they work with us.
No, this is just renal. Sorry.
Yeah, I think, okay.
So first, as you know, you have different groups that review different therapy areas, and these views are parochial to renal. I'm not speaking generically. I'm speaking specifically about dialysis and home dialysis.
So that was quite a good US perspective. I know that Marc, you're much more focused on the European markets. What have your experiences been there?
No, I think one of the challenges, beside the topic of the constant evolution of our solution and how to make sure that we can, push those evolution to the patient rapidly. The other aspect which has been a difficulty for us to speed up our access to the market is that our solution also changes the way the doctors and the patient is going to be looked after, meaning that our system is only one piece of the full patient journey from being detected as a patient with diabetes type 1 to actually being treated. And a patient with diabetes type 1 needs to go regularly to the hospital or to his doctor to check that everything's going fine, and he needs to be taken care at home by a nurse on a regular basis, depending on the country. And so all those organizations, first of all, they are country specific, of course. So for each country you need to adjust, but because our solution is really revolutionizing not just the life of the patient, but also the way you treat the patient, because it's already done, it's done automatically by the system, and you've got the data back home or back in the doctor's office to check that everything is fine. Suddenly all the reorganization of the care of the patient has to be taken into account. That part is easy because people can reorganize. The difficult one is who pays for what? Because of course, in some countries, for example, in France, the pocket for hospital is not managed by the same person that is paying for this device, which is not the same person, is not the same person that is pays for the home care provider, and also not the same one that pays for the insulin. And so suddenly, you come with a solution that, transform the whole experience and the whole, patient journey, really. And you are asked to prove that you reduce cost for your application, so your bits of the patient journey, but it's extremely complex to be also explaining how the rest of the organization is going to change. And we are a startup. We're not there to explain to each of the countries how they should organize themselves, but somehow we know we're going to reduce the cost of the overall experience. Maybe it's a bit more costly at first for the payer to actually pay for a solution, but actually the whole system is going to benefit. And this is change of paradigm for the payer, and the organization of the care of the patient is actually what is slowing us, access to the market. And I guess it's a different way to say what John was just saying, is that, suddenly you're putting the payer, or you're putting the doctors, or you're putting, people on a foot that they're not used to. And because it's patient lives we're talking about, they are very cautious, and that slows down the process. So that's really one thing that, is slowing down the launch of those kind of a technology.
But one thing on that, sorry, Layla, quick introduction. That one is, I think it goes to a bigger issue, which is every time you want to have a novel payment mechanism, Europe is a disaster, because you've got 38, you've got to do this thing 38 times. At least in the US, if you can hit CMS, you've got a big chunk of the market, if that's where your patients are. Why, maybe a question to Marc, why did you come to Europe first? Why didn't you go to the US and try and do it there, where at least you've got a more unified payer group? Because in Europe, I wouldn't come to, if I had a novel medical device again, I wouldn't come to Europe. And in fact, I'm hesitating about where I go with heart failure, because it's a challenge as to why come to European market. Why not go to US and China rather than coming to US and Europe?
Yeah. First, we are a French company. We've been extremely lucky to be supported by French grants and European grants, and extremely supported by patients and by doctors. And we owe them to actually address their problem on their market. And it's close to home. The CE marking, we got it in less than 3 years, so it was easy to get. And FDA approval to do clinical trials in the US and to address the US market, it's easier if you're in the US. So our decision was to first address the European market, and we will be on the market in less than 6 years from scratch, which for a Medtech with a highly disruptive solution is actually pretty quick. So our investors are always pushing us to go faster, but actually we are very quick. And yes, we'll be looking at the US market. But as you said, Jan and John, in the US, there's no code for artificial intelligence. So it's not going to be easier. I mean, yes, it's going to be easier maybe to get the FDA approval, but actually to get a payment for our bits of the system, it's going to be quite difficult.
So there's no code. We've touched on sort of geographic differences in terms of the healthcare systems, but going back to sort of patient centricity and the topic of this panel, have you got any comments about how the patient and the influence of patient advocacy groups differ across countries, and whether that's something that is very, very helpful as you're rolling out your business plans, or it's something that's conspicuous by its absence?
I mean, just on the diabetes side, frankly, they are all extremely active. They are all extremely engaged. They are the experts on, even more experts than the doctors on their specific physiology, and that's why you need to develop a product that is specific to them. And so to us, whether we talk to a UK, a US, a French, or German patient, frankly, the engagement we have, from them we have, and the response we have is very much the same. and the pressure they put on their payers and political organization within each of the countries is really helpful and is really actually making things change. But again, diabetes, as it's been said since the beginning, is a bit of a different pathology because patients are extremely engaged in their treatment. And I'll let John and Ian answer on their side.
Yeah, so I mean, having spent some time in diabetes previously, my observation is diabetes is one of the most advanced areas where patients have a strong voice. And I think it's a combination of the fact that one, there are so many patients with diabetes, and two, many aspects of the therapy today are self-administered. So all that gives rise to a strong voice. I've seen in my time where I've been involved in dialysis, which has been about 12 years now, I've seen an increase in patient voice. Initially, it wasn't really apparent at all as a strong stakeholder. That has changed. The patient voice is much stronger now. I think the community still struggles from the fact that it's a good thing that incidence of kidney failure is much lower than diabetes. Let's be absolutely clear about that. But a consequence of that is there aren't as many patients with kidney failure, and so they're not as visible, and politically their voice is not as strong, and so it's a challenge of the fact that it's a smaller community. Certainly, I've seen that with the advent of social media, there's been an acceleration in that in multiple therapy areas, but including dialysis, where that patient voice can be amplified. It also creates there's some really active Facebook groups where dialysis patients basically become peer-to-peer supporters, coaches in managing their therapy and their condition. And that is extremely powerful. And it goes back to, again, the backdrop of the technology innovation that wasn't specific to the medical field or medical devices, but has been a real enabler. So we're starting to see a voice, a stronger patient voice in a collective way emerging in our field, but it's certainly not where diabetes is.
And Ian?
Look, I think social media is an important one on this. I just think there's this big transition for us as we go from a group of people or patients who live alone without any relatives, without anyone who really looks after them, to a 70-year-old grandparent in the last 18 months of life. That's just a huge transition. They themselves are probably not going to be speaking up for themselves, but their children and grandchildren certainly will. So you have to have a patient voice. We are going to be using the news. We're going to be using the newspapers. We're going to have the Wall Street Journal. We are enabling the research to take place. This has been an ignored area. There's never been any real academic research into the complications of the way these patients are treated. That's now being enabled so that we can have the clinicians to stand up and say, we need to transform its care. But that comes with an audience of internet-enabled people. The 70-year-olds may not, but certainly their children and their grandchildren will, and that will drive the payer pressure here. And we're seeing Medicare Advantage in the US using this as a way to drive patient adoption by saying we offer these following new therapies, and that's an area where this Medicare Advantage is certainly a way to support the adoption of new therapies.
Great, thank you, Ian. I think we're nearly running out of time, so apologies to the audience if there are questions that we haven't got round to answering. But I would like to thank Marc, Ian, and John for their amazing insights into their experience and perspectives on patient centricity and the wider healthcare systems. Obviously, we've seen that it's an evolving situation where there's a lot of attention to patients. They are getting a stronger voice. There is stronger influence, but ultimately patients are one cog in a larger system, which is overall moving in the right direction, but there are still a number of challenges and barriers that need to be addressed. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much to all of our panelists for a really great session. And of course to Lala. I personally feel that those of us who may be or one day be patients are very lucky that there is such passion and insight behind the tools that are being developed. And also, if you've enjoyed this conversation, I'd like to recommend that you watch Greenlight Guru's talk on Thursday, which looks at patient centricity through a quality and compliance lens. It's a really great different way of looking at this, and lots of tips and tricks for medtech CEOs. Now, next up, we have another panel on the topic of delivering scale and value through collaboration and partnerships. I've actually had a sneak peek of this one, and it's a cracker, so make sure you check it out. It's from 1 p.m. British time. But in the meantime, thank you very much to our panel, and goodbye.